We also say, there's a myth about holding it in longer will get you higher. That's not true. You're just going to do more damage to your lungs. Don't do that.
That's a movie. Once again, movies. I never smoked, but like that's it. Like that's the thing. You take that and then you just hold it in. The longer you hold it in, the more manly you are.
Ask Willie, bro. He's a shaman.
And the higher.
Biscuits and tea.
34. Period. 99.
What is going on, folks?
Hello. We're here. Subdued again. We've had so many guests this time that
I know, yeah.
All the guests are making us behave, and people are going to start to think that we're proper and well-adjusted, behaved human beings. So I'm scared for our fan base,
Yeah, no, it's getting a little too proper. We might need to switch it up a little bit here this next show.
we can have King come back on.
Yeah, that's all we need to do. All right, well, guys, obviously we have guests here with us, very esteemed guests who we don't understand why they agreed to come. We tricked them into coming, and they're here now. So, Brandon, why don't you look it up?
Yeah, here's the deal. There's no intro that I'm going to be able to give that is really going to do justice because I pretty much know the surface level. Oh, I heard the audio kick back.
You're good. You're good. Cool, it was just Matt.
No, but yeah, Alex and Matt are on the show today. They are geniuses. We've had some conversations here, 10-minute conversations, and I cannot wait to get into the details here. But yeah, Matt, if you can kind of kick us off here and kind of give a little bit about yourself, and then Alex, you can too, and we get this thing going.
Okay, well, I'm a neuroscientist. I'm in Canada. I'm a professor. I study the brain. I've been doing that about 20 years. Most of the stuff I study is either how stress messes up our brain or what the effects of cannabis are, or like the brain's version of cannabis, because the brain makes its own molecules that are kind of like THC, sort of like cannabis endorphins, we can call them, so people get it. But yeah, so we've been studying that and how that helps kind of keep you calm and recover from stress. That's most of what I've been doing for the last 20 years.
Nice.
Yeah, thanks guys for having us on. I'm Alex Lohman. I'm also a neuroscientist with Matt at the University of Calgary and the Hotchkiss Brain Institute. He is definitely much more established than me at this stage in his career. But my research program's focused largely on interactions between the immune system and the brain. And we have a specific focus, over the past 2 years probably on traumatic brain injuries and specifically those of mild nature like concussions and how they're impacting things like adolescent state brain development and what are some of the long-term impacts of these injuries.
Okay.
I would just like to say, just really quickly, we should probably give clearly, my name's Will. I am a college dropout. I'm not a neuroscientist. It sounds so weird to have people coming on to say that they're scientists, and on the other podcast, we had a physicist who is a former NASA physicist. Now, I think we're maybe putting ourselves in a little hole here. Most of the time, when you do a show, you kind of make yourself seem smarter. I think we've gone the other way in making us seem like idiots. So I'm not sure if that's the best route, but
I'm not even gonna lie. I feel I'm a little nervous because I'm afraid I'm gonna say something so stupid that they're just gonna turn off their computers and then walk out of the room. Honestly.
Well, we should get it. As long as Tyler doesn't talk, then we should be fine.
Yeah, we'll be fine.
I can't figure out how to turn a mic on, so I think the bar is pretty low.
Okay. Well, I think one of the first things we obviously were going to get into, and we talked at least before we were getting ready to film. So there are a bunch of myths on both sides of the ball here that you guys can definitely get straight in and clear up for us. Whether that's already, as we talked about before filming, on getting concussed, what that means, and then also with cannabis and what that does to your brain, all the things that are out there, because it's insane when you're really trying to figure out the truth about what weed can do to your brain, what it does to, is it addictive? Is it doing this? Does it really kill brain cells? If I look at weed, will I grow a seventh arm or something? I mean, you guys are laughing, but like stuff like that is out
Good
there.
people
Like,
don't smoke weed. I don't know if you heard that.
I didn't hear about
That's
that.
from the U.S. government here recently. Who was that? Jeff Sessions who said that? Is that right?
Yeah.
Well,
Can we get the follow up on that, Matt? Would you agree with him there?
I feel like he has an alternative agenda.
yeah. Well, I would just I pulled up and Titos, maybe you could just pull this up for us, just as an immediate one, just to give us a good sense. And Matt, you can obviously chime in at any time, and you should probably. We've got more specific questions, but I just thought it'd be interesting because to give us a background, we've got weed myths, right up here, and this is the stuff that you would we got this by just basically typing in weed, and so I'm not sure if this is a pro cannabis website or not, but I just wanted to touch on some of the rhetoric that is used. Let me see if I can find just one. And it's really hard to study actually weed from what I'm understanding, but maybe you could just give us an understanding first off, just of the general sense of cannabis on a human brain. What does it do? Am I going to freak out if I smoke one joint? What's happening to me? Maybe we could just start there as a foundation. What happens when I smoke weed?
Okay, well, when someone smokes or eats, when someone consumes weed in any form, you usually, the part of weed that is responsible for getting you high is THC. So that's a molecule that the cannabis plant makes. When THC floods your brain, it sticks into these proteins called cannabinoid receptors. And in the easiest way of explaining it, basically what that does is that might mess up how two brain cells talk to each other, essentially. So you kind of do that across the entire brain, and that will just shift the way that you perceive things. It'll change some of your behaviors. It just kind of slightly tweaks the way that the brain processes information and produces behavioral output for the most part.
How does that difference from alcohol with what that does with your brain?
Alcohol is not really specific in the sense that basically what alcohol does is it interacts with all kind of there are neurotransmitters in our brain that excite cells or quiet cells down, and alcohol basically amplifies the chemical signals that make our cells calm down. So it's what we call a central nervous system depressant, because what it does is it kind of quiets down everything in the brain. Now, the reason why alcohol changes behavior is parts of your brain like the frontal cortex, which is like the part of our brain that, when you see someone do a dick move and you're like, you're an asshole, but you stop yourself from saying it. That's your frontal cortex. And when you get drunk, that basically stops working properly. So all that stuff that you would normally inhibit, you just kind of let it out. It's why the joke is that alcohol reveals who people are, because it kind of takes down that guard you put up about how you build your persona by quieting down the frontal cortex. The cannabinoid system doesn't really do that. It kind of just tweaks the way that cells talk to each other. So the way they work is very different. And this, if you compare this to something like cocaine or amphetamine, which are stimulants, they kind of do the opposite. They drive a lot of neural activity and create a state of hyperactivity. So there really isn't a lot of, there's kind of classes of drugs that work the same, but most drugs really affect the brain very, very differently from one another.
Is it just quick question? Because I've heard also with like opioids, like there's opioid receptors. So does that kind of work the same way as THC?
Yeah, actually, they're very similar. Opiates, the big difference that you see with opiates from cannabinoids is opiate receptors also exist in your brainstem where you regulate breathing and heart rate. And when they get activated, they quiet that down. That's why people overdose and die from opiates for the most common reasons, because they stop breathing and their heart stops. There's no cannabinoid receptors in that part of your brain. So that's why people can consume an insane amount of cannabis and have a horrible experience, but it won't kill them the same way that opiates would kill you.
I see. Okay, well, just as you touched on other drugs here, I'm just pulling this from weedmyths.ca. I'd just like to read you a very small portion here that I think is probably at the forefront of most people's brains when they're growing up. So it says weed is harmless. It's a question it's asking. So large population studies show that the younger you start and the higher amount of weed used will increase your risk of developing psychosis. So people who use marijuana while using alcohol, cocaine, or other drugs could be at greater risk from overdosing from those drugs. That's a really loaded question or loaded statement, I would say, because I don't know how many, recreational cannabis users are also using cocaine and heroin. So I don't know how they're necessarily getting that. But is that something that people need to be afraid of as kids? Am I going to develop psychosis if I?
I mean, there's a statistical relationship between cannabis use and developing psychosis. It's tricky. I think this has been something that the field has debated about for quite some time. I mean, you do see relationships, people who smoke, pot younger, especially that start using younger, using heavier, have a greater risk of developing psychosis. But to say that causes psychosis is a completely different game, because there's a lot of things that could explain why people who develop schizophrenia also smoke more cannabis, because there could be genetic relationships in the system. There's some research that suggests people who are prone to develop schizophrenia may just inherently like cannabis more. There's some theories that perhaps before the full-on disease kicks in, so the psychosis and the psychotic episodes are quite robust of symptoms, but before that there's a lot of symptoms like social withdrawal and anxiety and some distortions that people have. And so there's also thoughts that in that early phase people might be using cannabis to try and manage some of those symptoms. The reality is it's probably all of these things, but for different people. There probably are some people who using cannabis is a little bit like throwing gas on a fire, makes the disease come out worse. There are probably some people who are using to try and manage their symptoms. And there are probably some people who are using just because they like cannabis. And I mean, the rates of cannabis use in populations that have schizophrenia are incredibly high relative to the general population. So there is this association there. But the way that has been spun, certainly by people like Alex Berenson, who write these ridiculous books about like cannabis causing schizophrenia, leading to homicide and murder rates and everything. It's a complete neglect of the other possibilities that explain that relationship, and just basically buying all in on one thing and saying, this is what it is. Cannabis use makes you develop psychosis, then you get violent. And that's the angle he's taken, which is baseless in many ways.
Weed makes you a murderer?
Yeah. Tell Your Children. I mean, that's literally his book. It's called Tell Your Children. It's like a fear-mongering throwback to reefer madness from the 30s. It's insane.
Okay. Yeah, so it's kind of just like when they say, oh, everyone who's done heroin has smoked weed before. Like the weed must have, they probably just like drugs. So they started with weed and then they were going to get heroin at some point.
This is the question I always ask people. It's like, who goes from like not doing drugs to smoking meth? Like no one does this. It's not like weed is what I call, everyone like the old way they describe this as a gateway drug. I'm like, no, it's an entry level drug. It's completely different. It's accessible. It's easy to get. There's a lot less stigma around it. People are aware of it. So I feel like, you don't get someone jumping 5 steps ahead and like doing lines of coke and smoking meth from nothing in the background. It tends to be a graded process that people start to experiment with drugs that are less and less socially acceptable. Almost always starting with the initial ones. I mean, the reality is the relationships between those that smoke cigarettes and drink alcohol that progress to heroin are probably as strong or stronger than those that have smoked pot. Simply because, again, they're accessible. They're the legal options that people can get their hands on. So.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of playing the devil's advocate on this one. Saying that weed is a gateway drug. I think it's only a gateway drug in places that it's illegal, because obviously someone who is selling weed more than likely is probably selling other things. From my experience, at least in college. So when they get you, smoking weed, hey, want to try this or want to try that? I think that's the gateway. It's the person and that it's illegal. That's the issue. If people could go somewhere safe, or somewhere where they can just go in somewhere and buy it, and they don't have to come in contact with the black market of trying to get this stuff. And I think a lot of that stuff is avoided, obviously.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've made the exact same argument, because I think it's a pipeline issue. I mean, you go searching down that path to find weed, it introduces you to a whole new other set of drugs that you wouldn't have had exposure to. Yeah. So I agree. I think that's also one of the arguments that was made in Canada towards legalization, is it will kind of kill that pipeline access for kids, because certainly underage kids, that's where they'll go. I mean, if you're trying to get alcohol, kids will often like raid their parents' alcohol cabinet. That's where they go to get it. They're not going out in the street trying to buy it. Cannabis was legal and normalized in a similar way. The thought is that's exactly what it would be like. And you wouldn't be sending kids out on the street trying to access it. And then running in terms of black market dealers.
Yeah.
Is there a case for because I'm not entirely sure if this has been clarified specifically, but is there a case for the benefits of smoking weed and also on those benefits being better than say a recreational drug like alcohol that is just out and about? Is there a clear benefit to smoking weed recreationally as opposed to then drinking alcohol? Like,
I mean, I guess it depends on how you break that down. I think the argument would always be that anything that has potential harm or detriment is never considered beneficial. I'm sure individuals would disagree with that, with their own opinion. There was an analysis done by David Nutt in Britain, who used to be the advisor to the government about drug policy issues. He was actually fired because of this paper he put out in 2009 that basically demonstrated that alcohol across the board was far more dangerous for the individual and society than cannabis was, which was obviously, you say that in Britain, it's kind of at odds with the general opinion. So he has been actually like a leader in kind of pushing this, talking about the realities of what, the harms are that people actually face when they use cannabis versus alcohol. And so it's hard to say that there would be a benefit because, to be honest, this has never been studied. I mean, people don't study the beneficial aspects of recreational drugs. You look at where the funding structure in the United States comes from. It's the National Institute of Health, which for this is going to be under the National Institute of Drug Abuse. It's an entirely harm-focused perspective. I mean, you get grants by looking at the detriments of drugs. You're never going to get a large-scale funding grant to actually look at if there's any positive effects. And the unfortunate reality is the only groups that have actually looked at that tend to be advocacy groups, which are tainted. So no one's going to believe them anyways, because these are people who've been arguing for like pro-weed for years. So to actually say anything like that's difficult, I would say, to actually say, but I mean, anecdotally, there are certain people who report benefits from using cannabis on a regular basis. It's just hard to take those anecdotes and understand them in the reality of science.
That it does seem like something, it's not very scientific, I'm sure, but just how different you feel after a heavy night of drinking versus smoking, where your body, if you just listen to your body's telling you just never drink again. And of course you don't listen, but
yeah, I mean,
but just that
you can certainly look at the health tolls that drinking takes on the body versus cannabis use, and they're much worse. I mean, you have a lot more chronic health conditions that emerge in people who use alcohol chronically than those who use cannabis. And that was part of like what David Nutt was trying to talk about. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at in the acute term, at least, but in the long term, it's also true.
Yeah.
So something actually I was curious about is I have a family member with epilepsy, and they haven't experienced or they haven't tried cannabis at all or I think it's CBD oil is actually what they would use to help that. And I know they're on like a ton of medication that definitely growing up, it wasn't, I don't know, just looked like difficult. I was just wondering if you guys have looked or if you have any experience with like that with epilepsy.
I mean, there is certainly a growing body of work on epilepsy. Most of it's actually in the context of pediatric epilepsy. Like that's where almost all the stuff with CBD oil has been done. I mean, the first thing I'd say is in the States, you're kind of screwed because the reality is you have an unregulated market. So what you think you're buying as CBD oil is almost certainly not CBD oil. All the spot check data that I've seen has been like it's mixes of you guys don't have a regulated system.
Sorry, I just want to make sure I understand that point correctly. So, because CBD, like, and by the way, a bunch of CBD companies sometimes like have definitely emailed us, and we haven't sorted anything out. But are you saying because it's unregulated that there's just a ton of fakes? There's just a ton of
I mean, the spot check data that's come out of what people claim to be CBD oil in the States very rarely has CBD in it or has almost never the amount of CBD they claim. Quite often they've found synthetic cannabinoids cut in there to get people a little bit of a high so they think they're getting something. Sometimes even compounds that are in cough syrup like dextromethorphan has been found. Basically, you're taking cough syrup because it'll produce little biological effects that trick people into thinking that they're feeling something.
What the fuck?
Wow.
yeah, dude, that's a big deal.
It's a game. This is a game that happens when you have an unregulated market because there's no third-party assurance. There's no one doing testing on these products saying, you're right, even if you buy like an omega-3 supplement nowadays, it often has like a seal of approval from a third party that's done analysis on it. That does not exist for cannabis analytics in the States. It does not exist.
How is CBD oil made? What is that process?
I mean, there's a few ways you can go around it. It's usually just an extraction of some kind, either using CO2 or other processes to extract the oils out of the plant. And CBD oil, I mean, if it's from the plant, they usually have a plant that's been bred to be rich in CBD and low in THC, in theory. And then when you extract the oil out, you get an oil that's enriched in CBD with trace levels of THC in it. I mean, or you can spike it. I mean, that's kind of like what they do with the medical grade stuff, like the CBD product they use for pediatric epilepsy that the FDA approved is Epidiolex. Is basically it's an extraction that's been enriched in CBD, so it's very CBD heavy with trace levels of THC in it. But that's an actual pharmaceutical grade product, so that undergoes testing, so you know what you're getting with that. That's also why it costs so fucking much.
And I guess I might chime in on that with the, since legalization in Canada, we're seeing more and more, actual plants cropping up that are claiming to be, mostly CBD, where they bred them in a way. Do you have any insights on that? Is this true? Are we capable of breeding the THC out of the plant if you wanted to, say, smoke it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, and I will trust the Canadian analytics better because they are somewhat enforced by the government. So they do spot checks. And if what's written on the label doesn't match, it's like when you buy a pack of cigarettes and it tells you nicotine percent. That's kind of the way the Canadian system works. In terms of breeding plants for CBD, yes, definitely. So if you think of this from a biology perspective, the molecule that makes THC, the precursor, is the exact same as the molecule that makes CBD. So what that means is if you're feeding that into the plant and you want the plant to make something from that, it's either going to make THC or CBD. But the more you breed a plant to make THC, it means the less CBD it's going to make because it has the same amount of precursor. That doesn't change. And so by nature, over the last 20 odd years, because cannabis has been bred repeatedly to be higher and higher in THC because people want to get high off it, consequentially, CBD has basically been bred out of cannabis. So any street cannabis that anyone is using in the modern era is going to be completely devoid of CBD for the most part. So to actually make a plant rich in CBD, you have to explicitly breed it to breed out the THC essentially, because the enzyme that makes THC is different than the enzyme that makes CBD. And even though they share the same precursor, you build the plant to make CBD, it's going to make CBD and it's going to make very little THC.
So when people talk about like weed in the 70s and how there wasn't very much THC, does that just mean there was a ton of CBD in it?
There was certainly more CBD, but there was a lot more other stuff as well. I think also at that point, the plants just in general had less cannabinoid content in them and more leaf weight. They just weren't.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, like they've bred the plants to be denser in the enzymes to make it, but from the people I know who've worked on the Cannabis Genome Project and are more in the kind of botany side of things, they've basically said from a plant weight perspective, a cannabis plant cannot by nature make more than roughly 29 to 30% of its weight be in THC or in any cannabinoid in general. So like this, I find it amazing because there's these companies now I see in the States that claim that their cannabises have like 35% THC. And I'm like, I'm not actually sure that's physically possible because there is stem weight, there is plant weight, like leaf weight. There are other things that go into the plant that you just can't excise out. And so, I mean, to think.
And they can't just count. I always thought when they said that they just count like the bud is what percent of that was THC. But when you see the THC percentage, it's the whole plant.
It depends on who's doing the analytics. That's the thing. And because it's an unregulated system, it's really difficult to understand what people are referring to. I mean, some people, you can certainly get extracts that are like basically 98% THC. Like those do exist in the States, certainly with like the vape pens and things. But again, who knows if that's real?
Yeah. What would 98%?
Sorry?
I was just curious. As someone who's never smoked, what does 98% THC do to the brain and to you? Is that a better high?
I would imagine it would knock most people down. That's pretty...
Knock you down.
I would say this. It's like imagine you think you're about to drink a beer and you're actually drinking like moonshine. And you just take it down at the same level of volume and unexpected. I mean, you think of how much is actually getting in your system. I think that tends to be what happens with people when they, let's say, don't properly dose with cannabis, especially if they eat it. They're like, oh, I ate it. I didn't get high after 40 minutes. It must not work. Let me eat 3 times the amount. And then I'm going to spend the next 12 hours lying on the floor.
So that's what happens when you eat as opposed to when you smoke.
Yeah, I mean, it's just when you eat, it's harder to titrate because when you smoke, the THC gets in through your lungs straight into your blood, so it hits your brain pretty much immediately. So people feel it in about 2 minutes following consumption. So you're able to titrate. So someone can take, they'll take a hit, they'll wait a couple of minutes, they'll take a hit, they'll see how it affects them, and they go, okay, I've had too much time to stop. But when you eat it, it's got to go through your GI tract, and it's got to leak out into your blood, and that takes a while, and it's dependent on how much fat you've eaten. Like if you don't have any fat in your stomach, it's going to take a long time. But if you've eaten a fatty meat, it'll come quicker. But it can take easily 45 minutes up to 2 hours, and so people don't know how to time that. And especially if someone's naive and they don't recognize that there's a big difference, and they eat it and they're like, "Whoa, it didn't do anything." And this happens all the time. I mean, this was classic Colorado year one. People had no idea what they were doing, and things were unregulated, and they're just eating edibles, and there were so many ER visits because everyone didn't know what was going on.
No, yeah, I was in Seattle, so it was legal, and my cousin surprised me with some edibles, and I hadn't really done anything with them before, and I ate a couple chocolates, and I was like having a great time, really excited to be in the city to see him and everything. Didn't feel it after 20 minutes. Oh, I'm good. Ate 2 more. Yeah, that was not a good night. My body literally just shut down, and I was still able to like go out and walk around with them and like go to dinner, but like I just like my whole body felt like it was running on like 10%. That's the best way to explain it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there was the famous New York Times reporter, I think it was Maureen Dowd, who went down to Colorado when legalization happened. She'd never done weed before. She like had some edibles and definitely overate them and spent 12 hours lying on the floor of her hotel room thinking she was going to die, and basically wrote an opinion piece about like, why on earth would anyone do cannabis? This is the worst thing imaginable.
Okay.
I understand how the people working in these stores are learning.
So, with the the legalization side of things, and we're seeing more and more ways of consuming cannabis, and some of the big ones that I've seen cropping up are things like resins and dabs, which like you were mentioning can be like, as they claim, 90+%. Is it overkill? Like is there a point where you're wasting, like you don't need it that high because you actually are saturating the system at when you hit 50% and you're just excreting it, or does it work that way?
I would say that there's certainly not been the appropriate human studies done to actually look at the pharmacokinetics of anything like using something that potent. It's just not been done. I mean, we can kind of guess certain aspects of it. I mean, I don't understand the necessity of it when you think of the fact that, I mean, in the 70s, people were smoking cannabis that was like probably 3% THC, and people were fine with it. And granted, like that's gotten, more potent over the years. And what you see is people tend to titrate. So we've seen this in some of the data that's come out of Colorado. When people start buying more potent products, typically what they do is they end up consuming a little bit less, because there seems to be like a range of THC in your system that even if you're a chronic user, you don't want to go above that because it still produces a kind of an unpleasant aversive experience. So people do tend to titrate. That being said, what you do see more with these high potency products is it does seem to set the stage for people developing like problematic dependency in a different way than you would see from people using cannabis, just because of the potency and the way that it hits the system. I mean, there's a whole process of neuroadaptation that happens with chronic drug exposure, and some of that is influenced by dose. So obviously using a high potency product is going to throw those biological changes into effect in a different way, I would say. And it seems to increase the likelihood that someone will develop problematic use.
I've had a handful of friends who they would have the pens for a bit, and then they all would stop using them. They're just too convenient. It's like too much. Like it's just It's too easy to be high all day, every day with that. Versus if you have to actually prep a little bit or be more discreet of where or when you're smoking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole other aspect, is the convenience side of it. I think that the two together, I mean, that just certainly, I just don't see the need for it. I mean, my view is I look at the legalization that's gone on in Canada, and I'm like, we don't have anything like that, at least right now. I mean, there are some vape products, but they're not like the high potency things like what we're talking about here. I just don't see I don't understand the necessity to it, because I feel like people who want to use have a wide range of options they can use from. It's not like they're not going to be able to get their desired effect. But why would you bring something into the market that does actually introduce a different level of risk. It just, I don't, to me, I don't get it from like, I mean, I guess you can get it from a drug maker perspective, because obviously anyone who works in alcohol, tobacco, or now cannabis legal industries, their end goal is the more people addicted, the more product that's bought. So they have a very different agenda. So I can see why they would want to get it on the market. But from a government perspective, from a regulation standpoint, I just don't see the point of it. I don't see why you'd need to have products like that accessible, because they're just going to increase the likelihood that something negative will happen. And there's plenty that don't. So
I was just going to ask, since you mentioned obviously the goal of, if you're in that industry, it would be to try to get more people, more and more people on that drug or whatever it is that your product is. Is there a way that they're doing that? Is weed in any form or capacity? I mean, you said dependency, but you're not saying necessarily addiction. Is there a separation in there, or? I
don't know. The only reason I use that word is I would say addiction has become such a loaded word. I try and avoid using it because I'm not a researcher who studies addiction, and a lot of my friends who are, it can be really very vitriolic, polarizing debates about using that word and calling someone an addict or saying that someone has addiction. So right. I can't say I understand all the arguments behind the different language that's used. I tend to say dependency because that just refers more to a physical state that someone would be in. Like if you use a drug too much and you go off of it, and then you have withdrawal symptoms, or you have things that may motivate use again, I would say that more relates to a dependency. And then I would kind of put that under the frame of problematic use. I mean, we would call it cannabis use disorders, technically the thing, but that's what we used to call people alcoholics. Now you say they have alcohol use disorder, if you're talking in the addiction lingo. So I would say that, yes, there are people who become, I guess you could say, quote unquote, addicted to cannabis, the same way I'd say dependent. It's just proportionately, it's a lot less than what you would tend to see with a lot of other drugs. And the way it manifests is also very different. I mean, this is the argument that a lot of people make, is that there are a lot of, I guess, what you would refer to as more functional dependence on people who are dependent on cannabis, but are functional in the sense that they can not have their lives collapse around them the way that often happens if you have a dependency on alcohol or something. Yeah. And the withdrawal is very different.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyler.
Do you have any insight for when people say they're heavy smokers and then they stop and their dreams get super, super vivid? Do you have any insight on that?
I can take a guess. I mean, again, I'm appalled that more people don't study cannabis and sleep. It just doesn't make any sense to me, because it's like the number one thing across the board that people tend to use cannabis for. And one of the things that we know is that, so if you look, I mean, there have been studies done on this. The Canadian military did a study on people with PTSD who had like vivid nightmares as part of their PTSD. And it creates a huge problem, because the nightmares mess up the sleep, and then the lack of sleep fucks up the day-to-day life, and it becomes a vicious cycle. And what they found was they were using a synthetic THC pill that they put them on. And when they put them on it, almost immediately, like 85% of them stopped having nightmares right away. Wow. And they were able to sleep better, and then the kind of trickle-down effect for their daily life was improved. And this has been kind of anecdotally seen. That's the only study where they've actually measured it, and it was a relatively small study, so it hasn't gotten the same, and it wasn't cannabis because it was a synthetic THC pill, but it fit with the idea of what we know. There is some data that has suggested that like THC and cannabinoids can suppress REM sleep. REM is the part of sleep where we dream. And so you would imagine that if someone's smoking pot constantly, that they're kind of tuning that down. Every time, any kind of drug withdrawal that you would ever see an effect of is the opposite of what the drug does. So if cannabis often and THC is suppressing dreams or nightmares, if that's where your dreams go, you can imagine that the rebound that would come off of that by going through withdrawal is going to be the exact opposite. And so that's a very commonly reported withdrawal symptom of cannabis, is these very vivid dreams, I would say bordering on nightmares for a lot of people from the way they describe it, but very vivid dreams that they have when they stop smoking weed after smoking for a long
time. I was just going to ask, since you said synthetic, does it matter? And I don't even know the difference. What is synthetic weed versus natural?
Yeah.
Actually, I should say something before that.
Okay.
Just that I have, at least at a minimum, I have two friends who I remember being out with him years ago now, maybe 7-8 years ago, and we were at the bar. He smokes weed all the time. That's just, he's, I mean, I wouldn't say, once again, that he's dependent or addicted by any means, but he definitely smokes. and he decided to try a synthetic weed that night. And I basically ended up having to babysit him for the entire night. I don't know what happened, but he had one of the strangest, and he was fine. It's not, I'm not saying he wasn't bouncing off the walls, he wasn't doing anything, but his anxiety just went off the charts. And I mean, we were sitting outside the bar. He was just like, "Don't leave me, Will. Like, please, like, just stay here." Like, it was one of those, I'd never seen him like that. And, you know, but he said, yeah, he essentially, I don't think he ever smoked synthetic weed again.
No, I mean, so when I say synthetic for the study that was done in Canada, so they're kind of synthetic. So that is something called nabilone, which is basically pharmaceutical grade THC. So it pretty much is THC, but it's made in a lab, and it's slightly different, but largely what it does is basically recapitulate what THC is. Synthetic weeds that are on the street, like K2, Spice, all this other stuff that has hit the market, it's basically chemically synthesized drugs that bind to the same receptor as THC, but very differently than THC. They're often a lot more potent. And so those drugs get made and then sprinkled on something like that's smokable, like a potpourri or something, and then people consume them that way. Those are so much worse. Again, if you think of the doses in the poison, I mean, THC, the way that it sticks to the receptor that it does, it doesn't evoke a massive response, let's say, if we're looking at a cellular level. So THC binds to its receptor in brain cells, and it has an effect, which we'll say is, let's say, on a scale of 1 to 10, it's a 4. A lot of these synthetics, they're so much more robust. When they bind to the same receptor, they hit like an 8. So the effect that they produce is so much more robust than what you see. And so a lot of the adverse effects you see when people use synthetics, which often are like panic attack, anxiety, sometimes full-on psychotic episodes, are amplified versions of things that you would see with cannabis, but quite rarely. And the other thing with those synthetics is they actually, unlike the fact that people won't overdose on cannabis per se to a fatal level, there are numerous documented cases of people using synthetics and having heart attacks and dying, because there are a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the heart, but the way that they tend to get interacted with by THC isn't, we don't see the same relationships there. There is some potential concern, but the synthetics, there have been people that go into arrhythmias and have heart attacks and drop dead, and that hasn't been that uncommon. I was always baffled why these even existed. I'm like, why does synthetic cannabinoids exist? Why would anyone use a chemical version of a drug that is accessible? And I learned why we don't really have it really in Canada much. It's in the States because your guys' rampant drug testing. It's another consequence of prohibition, because you will pass a drug test with a synthetic cannabinoid. You will not pass a drug test if you smoke pot, especially for how long THC stays in your system for. And so what you end up getting is a lot of people who have to undergo regular drug testing using these drugs instead, which actually makes it more dangerous. And they're more likely to have an adverse event from using them than they would from cannabis. But because of the legal regulations, that's the choice they made.
Oh my God, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. That kind of perfectly segues into the question I had, because here in the States, like literally this time last year, there was all this crazy news about teens, and not even just teens, but people using vape pens. So are the oils and stuff that are in most of those pens, that's synthetic, correct? I'm guessing.
It depends. Most of those, usually the pens are based on extractions. The problem of what happened with the vape pens in the States, and again, this is because it was an unregulated market, was they were getting cut. The thought is it was being cut with like something like a vitamin E that was in the oil, and the vitamin E, when it combusted, was creating a massive irritant that was causing lung inflammation. So, I mean, we've never seen any of this in Canada, and you've never seen this with any kind of pure extract that's just done using CO2 or like an ice extraction or something that people have used to pull cannabinoids out. That was because the solvent, like the fatty solvent they were putting the THC in to vape, which is usually like a propylene glycol base, was being cut with vitamin E, and the vitamin E seems to have been what was causing the damage.
Okay. Yeah, because that's kind of interesting, because I mean, the article here, T-Tiles, I don't know if you want to pull that up real quick. But basically, the article kind of outlines the issues that people are having with vaping, and it always kind of seemed like THC was just kind of thrown in there. So I kind of want to ask you guys, because it kind of seems like they're kind of blaming it on the THC, whereas like we just said, like it's being, because it's unregulated, it's being cut with things that make it dangerous, and now we're in a situation where it seems like a placed media attack on the legalization of marijuana in a way, by throwing it in there with that when it's not even what we're trying to legalize.
Yeah, I would. I mean, I would agree that there's a bias being introduced here in the way that this is being spun, and this is the way that I would say a lot of the prohibitionists who want to keep cannabis illegal have. I mean, they often will take something that has some truth to it and spin it in a way. And the one example I always use is the way that they've tried reporting that post legalization, there's been more cannabis induced fatalities in motor vehicle accidents. And that's the argument they've made. And this is not factually true because what they've done is all they've done is shown that if you look at tox screens from fatal motor vehicle accidents, you end up seeing that more people have tested positive for THC. But because THC will stay in your system for 30 or more days after use, it also depends on how frequent of a user you are, how much body fat you have. I mean, you can test positive weeks out. And so this isn't like alcohol or cocaine, who have very short half-lives and kind of go in and out of your body, where you can do a drug test and say, oh, yes. I mean, if the person has incredibly high levels of THC, sure. But more often than not, what these studies have simply shown is that someone tested positive. And there's no indication that that person was intoxicated when they were driving. But there's a lot of groups, especially in the States, that are very anti-legalization, and they keep shooting out these data points as arguments about, oh, in Colorado, there was all these cannabis-related fatalities that happened. And then you actually look at the data and you're like, but Colorado actually had no actual change in fatal motor vehicle accidents pre and post legalization, which is actually the meaningful data because if you could somehow create a world where there was no alcohol and then introduce alcohol and look at the consequence on fatal motor vehicle accidents, it would be astronomical. There's no way around this. I mean, it's why we've tightly regulated drinking and driving so much. And it's not to say that people shouldn't drive high. Obviously, you shouldn't drive if you're intoxicated on anything. You shouldn't be texting and driving. But in a proportionate manner, when you look at the driving studies that are done with alcohol versus cannabis, I mean, alcohol is very clear. People don't realize they're intoxicated and they drive faster across the board. You always see this. What you always see with cannabis is people, like we jokingly call it like a grandma effect. Like someone gets high and they drive like 30 and they just kind of like, they're terrified. They're very aware of the fact that they're high. They're very aware of the fact that they're driving a car. And a lot of people get super anxious about it and they end up driving slower. And so even if reaction times are compromised, they may still get in accidents. They don't seem to be the same as alcohol where people are speeding. And so there is some data out of Washington that would say that, yeah, after weed was legalized, there was like a mild increase in fender benders, but not in fatalities. And that's not surprising to me because that's more of a realistic endpoint I would expect. You get some people driving high, they're going to get in accidents more, but they're not speeding like they are when they're drunk. So they're not going to be having massive collisions. So again,
ties in as well. And Matt, the data behind this a little more than I do, but I think there's been a big myth as well where, everyone thinks if we legalize, everyone's going to start smoking weed and it's going to become this big pandemic. But I think what we've seen in Canada is you don't get more people smoking weed. The people who were smoking weed are still smoking weed, and you might have a little bit of uptake of new users, but nothing's really changed outside of having it regulated, having it tested, having it, produced and delivered in a safe format. But I don't know, maybe you know something else, but my impression with Canada was there wasn't this massive spike in users, it was still the same people who were smoking.
Yeah, I mean, you see the one thing that's important, and I think and they saw this in every state as well, you don't see any change in teenage use. If anything, it even drops a little. Like some data has said it's even gone down in a couple states. So you really haven't seen teenagers increase. There is some, like you said, Alex, there's like little bits of people who I think hadn't tried simply because of legal status. And now that it was legal, they're open to trying, but that represents a relatively small number of people. And I would say that also doesn't represent the majority of people who are going to continue using cannabis. That's kind of like, oh, it's exciting. Let me try something new. Right. Now it's not taboo anymore. The one age group or the one demographic you reliably see increased cannabis use in following legalization, this was true in every state and it's true in Canada, is women over the age of 55. And there's been a lot of theories about this. I kind of have this perspective that it's a mix of, these are, in our age demographic right now, it's most likely people who grew up in the 70s and 80s when they were kind of in that age, like, it was a little bit more free love. It was before the 80s, like Wall Street capitalist nightmare kicked in and everyone was like alcohol and cocaine and, no one likes hippies anymore. But in that era, it was very common for people to smoke weed. And then I think as they grew up, it became taboo and they stopped. And now that it's legal, they're like, you know what? I liked this when I was younger. And then the other theory is that because women over 55 also have a lot of chronic pain issues and sleep problems, they might just be trying cannabis out more to try and see if it helps with any aging related issues that are there. But yeah, you really haven't. I mean, there are certainly is a subset of people who have started using more because of the accessibility of it being legal. But like Alex said, they were already users. And so there's a little bit of concern around that, like, making it accessible. The people who may have been moderate users now becoming heavier users, but we haven't seen a huge amount of data to suggest that that's actually what's happening. For the most part, it was like literally nothing happened. Like, I'm just amazed that no one in the world is talking about this, given how much hype went into building up, like, oh, the world will end, society will collapse, everyone will have reefer madness if you legalize, it's just terrible. And like, we're basically at 2 years now, like we're about 6 weeks out of being 2 years into legalization. And I don't think anyone in Canada would attest to the fact that they've seen any change in any variable of day-to-day life from cannabis being legal.
I thought Portugal kind of already disproved that when they just legalized everything. And the last I saw, they didn't really have any major upticks in drug use in general.
Yeah, I would say, Portugal took a bold approach with the way they did things. I think, I'm not sure why.
What's Portugal's approach? What did they do? Exactly?
Everything's
they
legal.
just kept legalized everything.
Is it legal or decriminalized?
I think it's legal.
I can't remember. Maybe someone can fact check that. I can't remember if it's legal or decriminalized, but they did an across the board of everything to try and use it as a strategy to reduce drug use. It certainly hasn't resulted in a spike of drug use. That's for sure. I think Canada was a little bit more under scrutiny because it was like a federally regulated cannabis specific, and we're, I think, a little more integrated into the Western U.S., Canada, Britain. Portugal's obviously still part of Western Europe, but it's not a country that you hear a lot about the same way. And I actually think most people don't even know that happened. Whereas I do think the majority of people know that Canada legalized cannabis.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. I had no idea about Portugal. Yeah. That's a way bigger deal than legalizing weed. If people are Ronaldo's hopping on the field doing acid, it's completely acceptable.
Yeah.
I mean, Uruguay did something like this too. Yeah, it's decriminalization. So Uruguay did something like this. Uruguay has legalized cannabis, and they may have legalized other drugs as well. But again, I don't think there was anything noticeable that happened there. But I know that there were Canadian officials going down to Uruguay in advance of legalization to get some perspective from them.
So can we not expect that same thing? I mean, the U.S. hasn't, obviously, as a whole. We're not there yet, but as it seems, there's a lot of momentum moving us towards there. So is there any reason to believe that it would be any different in the U.S., or is the U.S. just some special, beast where all hell is going to break loose and Florida's just like going to... I mean, Florida's another story, so maybe I should...
I don't know. I was going to say, you guys over the last couple of years have proven to be a bit more of a powder keg than I anticipated on a lot of issues. I would assume that there's no reason to assume, at least, why there would be any profound change. I mean, like I'd been saying before, if you actually look at the raw numbers, because of the states that have gone full legal for recreational, you guys are at a point where almost 50% of your actual population live in states that have legal recreational cannabis. And sure, people tried saying, when Colorado changed, there was these things that happened. And yes, there was some shifts that happened in Colorado with, other stuff related to crime and things. But one thing that can't be ignored in that situation is you had a single state with no borders amidst a country full of illegal. So obviously what happened when Colorado went legal is a shitload of people flooded into that state for various reasons, some of which to get cannabis to bring back to their home state to sell for whatever purposes, some to get involved in the system that was developing there. Colorado also opened its floodgates with zero regulation. So you had billboards, talking about go to your bud tender, and there was no regulations on advertising, and that was something that Canada did very strictly. So I guess it would be a question of how the states approached this, because One thing that Canada did is each state that has gone legal so far has done it differently. Every state has their own set of rules, which has made it in some ways difficult, but also from a scientific perspective, some ways interesting. Because the way I've looked at the states is each state is a pilot experiment that you can learn from what worked and what didn't work by comparing the different models and seeing what came out. I would say we look at Colorado and we say a free market paradigm is not good because you do seem to increase use in the general population. You have uninformed bud tenders telling people shit like encouraging pregnant women to smoke because it reduces nausea and like things that you really shouldn't be doing because of the fact that there was no regulations around it. We know that ads, like companies, like I was saying, if you're a company that makes weed as a profit, the same way alcohol or tobacco did, your goal is to get people addicted. We know that adolescence is the window to hit if you want to get people hooked on something. And so alcohol and tobacco did this for a long time, kind of glamorizing how cool it was to drink and smoke cigarettes. And that really appealed to teens who wanted to be cool. And we know the psychological impact that had on promoting drug use in those kids. So, I mean, like Canada's been incredibly strict on restricting, like you cannot advertise cannabis in any domain where someone under 18 could be, which actually means the only way you can advertise cannabis is essentially in a bar that has age-gated, where there's a bouncer limiting who comes in. So bars have become a big site for weed posters to advertise buying weed because you cannot advertise anywhere in Canada. And so the companies have argued from their perspective that this has killed the market because it hasn't developed properly. And they've been like, no one can name a weed company the way you can name Players or Du Maurier for cigarettes or, Budweiser or whatever for beer. Like you can think of like Hallmark brands. I mean, I'm kind of on it's also a new industry. So obviously no one's going to learn the main players. Like no one knew who the fuck Bud was 1 year after it was out. But I'm like, it takes time to build credibility into something like that. But that's the argument they've tried making. And I do think Canada didn't do everything 100% properly. I think they were very cautious in some ways. And even from a research perspective, they actually have screwed us over a little bit because of the way they put the regulations in. We thought this was going to make doing research in humans especially way easier. And it's actually almost made it more complicated. And so we are in no better position almost to do research on humans smoking pot than there has been in the States. It's just been, it has more to do with the way that you'd run a clinical study and how they define a clinical study now. And I mean, basically to run a clinical trial, you need to have a drug that all the pharmacokinetics on, the dosing, the predicted effects and blah, blah, blah. The problem is you could do that if you isolated THC. And that's, like I said, that pharmaceutical grade THC Nabilone. You could do that because dosing, pharmacokinetics. Every strain of cannabis is going to be slightly different. And so the generalizability is a problem. And even within a given strain, based on, heat exposure, light exposure, there's a whole bunch of things that can affect the stability of those cannabinoids. You could have the same, kind of cannabis, but, 2 months later, it's actually very different because it's been sitting in the sun. It's dried out. THC is decayed. And so the consistency in the product that they're administering to people can't be guaranteed in a certain way that the government expects because it's not a pharmaceutical, that it's made it almost impossible to get the red tape approved to actually do a study where you have people come into the lab and get them high smoking a joint and then look at the effects. And this is, in the States, because it's a Schedule I drug, it's an incredible amount of red tape to get through the hoops. I mean, I think I told you guys this before, but the joke, my friends in the States who are human drug researchers say it's easier to give someone meth than it is THC in a lab setting because of the paperwork required around that. Because methamphetamine is less regulated. It's a Schedule II, so it's easier to get into people than THC is. So I know there's some people who've been super creative in how to get around this. Like I have a friend in Colorado and he set up what they call a Canavan. And I think this is amazing because they actually wanted to study like these things like dabs and shatters and high potency products. But you can't give someone, like you can't be a federally funded researcher and go to a cannabis store and buy these products and give them to someone because it's not federally legal in the States still. And so what they have to do is they have this kind of like relationship where they have people who sign up for studies and they call them. And when the person's about to smoke in their own volition in their own home, they drive the van over, wait out front for the person to get high. Then the person comes into the van. They can draw blood. They can do all their psych testing on them and actually get data. And then they know the product they use so they can cross-reference it and actually see what it looks like that they're using. And so they have all this data, but they can't go into that person's house because as federal researchers, if they set foot in that person's house, it would make it a research site. So it changes the structure of everything. So there's all these weird loopholes you have to go through to actually try and study this shit in humans.
Do they in the mystery machine or like a Volkswagen?
I feel like it's not quite a hippie van, but it has to be outfitted. I mean, it's got to be something like that because the way they've got it set up, you've got to do phlebotomy to draw blood. You've got to have computer screens to do psych tests and stuff. So it is a big open space kind of cube van style that they have. But
why couldn't they just get a group of people that live close to the border and just bring them into Canada for a day and then get whatever data they need for that?
American researchers wouldn't be able to do that. Canadians, in theory, could, but you couldn't bring the product you bought in the States with you across the border. And because on the Canadian side, because of our regulated system, we don't have the high potency stuff for sale the same way you do in the States. Because the unregulated system, like if you were able to buy a product in Washington State and drive across the border into Vancouver and go to a lab there, sure, you could kind of do that. But even though it's legal in Canada and it's legal in Washington State, it's a federal border where it's illegal, so you could never move a product across.
So you couldn't set up like a proxy, like if they
we
actually
don't have
made it
any.
in
None of those high
Canada
potency
too.
products
Like,
are
hey,
on
this
the
is the
market
same
for
thing
us.
we make in
So
Washington.
you could have some. I mean, in theory, you could have a Canadian lab study someone who smokes a joint or a product they can buy legally from the Canadian system, and there may be some people doing some of that kind of work. More though, where there's the struggle is actually trying to do like the clinical style studies, where you're like, like you were saying about epilepsy, does this actually treat epilepsy? Is there any benefit here? Is there any benefit for PTSD? Is there any benefit for chronic pain? These are the medical questions that like everyone has wondered, and the data is so sparse and generally not well collected because of the limitations.
So there's not an answer to that? So there's not an answer. I thought that general consensus was essentially that it does help PTSD, that it does help certain things like this, and people that have cancer going through certain treatments, right? That's at least that's what movies tell me. Yeah, right. Like this person goes on chemo and then he has to smoke weed, or this person has glaucoma, he's got to have weed. Like that's what the movies say.
Okay, I would say this. So there is different kinds of evidence you can use to make decisions about whether you trust something. So in humans, there are a few ways we can go about this. You can have an anecdote, which is you telling me you smoked a joint and you felt happy afterwards. Therefore, you now believe cannabis makes you happy. That's an anecdote. You can have an observational study where someone doesn't ask people, but just watches them and collects data on people who are chronic cannabis users versus those that aren't. Huge ton of problems that can roll in there because there's also their lifestyle factors that can influence the differences. You can do kind of an open label study, which is not blinded, where someone knows they're getting a product. And you can either give some people placebo and some people product, but you have expectancy bias because someone knows what they're taking. So they kind of, a million people told me CBD was going to cure my anxiety, so I take CBD and now I feel less anxious, therefore it works. And that's huge in the cannabis field. Expectancy bias is very difficult to get around. Or you can do like double-blind studies where, someone does not actually know what they're getting. They shouldn't even actually be aware that it's a cannabinoid drug if you really want to blind people, because then they have no expectations whatsoever. And then you track them over time and look at, the outcome measures and did the disease get better or not. Those kind of high quality, double blind, placebo controlled trials are virtually entirely absent for cannabis because of like what I said in terms of the inconsistency and the differences in strains. They exist for some like cannabis based products, like the thing I was saying, Epidiolex, what they use for the pediatric epilepsy. It's like a mouth spray, basically. You spray it under your tongue, but it's a controlled amount of THC and CBD we know is in there. Or the Canadian version is Nabalone, which is like a THC-like pill. It's like a synthetic THC pill. Like those are controlled dosing. So those they've done trials with. My perspective and belief is if you see an effect with a THC CBD mouth spray, or you see an effect with the THC pill, that is likely going to be a similar effect you'd see from someone using cannabis. But technically, you can't actually say that because it's not a study done with cannabis. Yeah. And so this is where the complication has come about, because there are maybe 4 or 5 studies that have ever been done really with smoked cannabis or inhaled cannabis, and they're virtually impossible to do properly. And so a lot of this is extrapolation, like making assumptions if X worked and Y is related to X, Y probably works as well. But there's a very big gap there. And so the community that does not believe that there's any medical benefit of cannabis consistently says this over and over. They say there's no evidence that cannabis treats any medical conditions. And again, this is a wordplay manipulation because it's like, well, that's true, but it's true because there haven't really been any studies. That's very different than there have been studies that failed. And that's the kind of like verbal games that a lot of people play when they try and manipulate things to make it seem like there's very clear data that something doesn't work. When I'm like, there's just no data. Like you're completely gaming this the way that you describe it.
So does this work both ways with negative effects then? Because about maybe 6 weeks ago, I suffered a collapsed lung while I was training, and the doctors had to get surgery for it. And when I was getting surgery for it, the doctors kept asking, like, "Oh, do you smoke weed? Like, do you smoke weed?" Because they are saying that it creates a much higher risk for a collapsed lung if you smoke weed.
There certainly could be some truth to the fact that smoking anything creates combustion byproduct, and the combustion byproduct might amplify inflammation in your lung. Why that would relate to a collapsed lung, I have no idea. I would imagine that what dictates a collapsed lung is the physical trauma. That's my guess. To some degree, I can't imagine cannabis alone would be a risk factor in that. I've never seen that come up on any of the long-term health analysis that's ever been done in cannabis users. So I do. The thing that bothers me is the people who write off all the data about the potential positive effects of cannabis have no problems embracing the negative data, despite the fact that it's as problematic. So my perspective is be agnostic. You sit in the middle because it's like, sure, there's going to be a subset of people where cannabis has adverse effects. That's clear. There's going to be a subset of people that genuinely benefit from cannabis in some medical conditions. I think that's probably clear at this point too. But I don't understand. I mean, and I think the perspective is, well, you should always err on the side of caution. So believe negative and be wary of positive. And I think that's the general perception that's been taken by the medical community. And I can understand that. I'm not a physician, so I don't have to prescribe anything to people. I don't have an ethical cloud hanging over me about if I say something and then something goes wrong, am I then liable or morally accountable for that? So it's different for me to say this than a physician, but I don't understand that perspective. I don't understand, like, when you have a fair amount of converging evidence that creates a compelling argument that yes, X could actually be beneficial for disease Y, why you would be so quick to discredit that. But then the data, linking cannabis and psychosis is basically a statistical relationship and nothing more. Yet everyone and their dog in psychiatry seems convinced of the fact that if you smoke pot, you're going to become schizophrenic, despite the fact that like 50% of Canadian teenagers smoke pot, and we have the same schizophrenia rates as like Norway, where 2% of the teenagers smoke pot. Like, how is that not a more relevant data point? It's a very strange. As we've seen in the last year, the politicization of science is scary because people, I think in the general public, just trust science as a thing, although less so now than they have in the past. And I feel like it can be so easily skewed and manipulated by the way that someone presents data with the context that they present either the study or the outcomes being from.
That was something else, like kind of along those lines, that stood out with the collapsed lung, because it also, one of the big factors of it is like, oh, if you're like a young, like athletic, like tall man, that's a much higher risk. And from when I was in college, like that's also like most of the guys that are smoking like fits that description. It's just athletic, like guys who.
And this is the problem with statistical relationships. I mean, the joke we always use in science is there's like a 99% correlation between like use of margarine and divorce rates going up. Through the 80s and 90s, people became disgusted by margarine and marriages became more dissolving. So they're a completely unrelated phenomenon, but if they track together, human beings love making associations. Our mind loves coupling events, and so we just have this innate tendency to do it. And I think with cannabis, for the better and for the worse, depending on where you sit on the fence, people do this all the time.
Matt, with you've been touching a lot on benefits, drawbacks, myths, kind of what can we hold on to maybe as more of a truth or not. A lot of things still up in the air, but you briefly mentioned one thing that's really close to my interest, and that's the adolescent state. And I think you said something along the lines, kind of relating other things like alcohol, nicotine, and cannabis kind of being directed towards that age group because they're more persuadable. If that's the right word. But I have read some papers that make these claims that while we don't really see a ton of negative drawbacks for using weed, the adolescent state seems to be one area where using cannabis might not be.
I mean, I would emphasize the word might because I would say that's really inconclusive. I think that, we just got a really big grant to look at varying levels of cannabis exposure using rodent models on brain development. Like, do you start younger? Do you use multiple times a day? Using cannabis vape chambers that we have for the rodent models, we can control this level of exposure through varying adolescent windows. But the reality is, if you look at the human data, it's really not very convincing. For one thing, there is a large inconsistency in how anyone determines how someone as a teenager smoked pot. They often just ask you, "Have you smoked pot?" I mean, there is one study that came out where they were looking at brain changes from someone who smoked pot once during adolescence and claiming that it had an effect on the brain growth. I just don't understand how this is possible. Like, from an actual biological standpoint, I literally cannot understand how smoking a joint once could have an effect on brain development in the context of the fact that THC is binding to the same receptor that molecules that are blooming through the brain during adolescence are binding to as well. Like, sure, the way THC binds is slightly different, but to have like a profound effect on brain growth from a single exposure seems bizarre and like unbelievable to me in many ways. But the neuroimaging data is really problematic because often what they do is they'll take someone who's an adult and say, "Did you smoke pot as a teenager?" And then they basically break you into two groups and say, "Okay, here's teens who smoke pot and those that didn't." And then they do structural analysis of the brain and they say, "Oh, look, those that smoked pot had smaller brains, therefore cannabis reduces brain growth." But they don't account for all the other factors that come into this. And this is the same that they found with the IQ and neuropsychological functioning. I mean, they realized when they actually went back, and others have now tried to replicate those original studies by doing twins, they realized that, the identical twin who didn't smoke pot had the same brain changes or had the same IQ changes. And so it likely is almost more likely a pre-existing difference that may relate to those who choose to use cannabis versus those that don't. But even in those populations, you get these very bimodal distributions where you have one subset of people who use cannabis in adolescence are people who probably have a pretty rough life. They live in bad neighborhoods. They have a lot of, parental, familial fighting. They have, they could be exposed to various things in their day-to-day life that are very stressful. And they don't just use cannabis. They drink, they smoke cigarettes. They tend to use whatever they can get their hands on because for a lot of these kids, this is a means of somewhat of escape of their day-to-day life. And certainly in that context, any drug use is negative because it becomes a crutch in many ways. People tend to use it to cope. And then you have this other the other side of the curve is kids who tend to be from relatively wealthy backgrounds and very affluent and well off. And so they may use cannabis pretty regularly, but they have the financial means to keep themselves fine. And they go on in life and do things, and they never get studied because they never pop up on any metrics for anything. And they typically aren't included in anything. And so I've always made the argument that really we should be trying to study both arms of this population to figure out what are the variables that relate to those that might have adverse reactions versus those that seem to be resilient. And my thought is a lot of this relates to life stress. I think that if you have had a lot of early life trauma or if you're a teenager who's undergoing a lot of concurrent adolescent social stress, you throw cannabis in the mix to there, sure, you could get some interactions because both those things have the potential to mess up brain development. And I emphasize the word potential because it doesn't mean it's going to, because there are plenty of people that smoke pot and there are plenty of people that grow up in very traumatic and stressful situations that come out the other side of that with no pathology. And then there are others that just seem to not even have to have been much exposure and have very adverse responses. And so there's some other variable that is dictating this. So I guess
that myth then, because you've touched on it, and just to make it clear, there is not necessarily then a general consensus on if I smoke, I am not going to kill my brain cells. That's like the thing. I can remember my DARE class. You guys remember DARE? Did you guys know DARE? Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's true. Yeah, but
you saw a different DARE than I think me and BJ.
I remember my DARE very well, and it was very clear to me. At least I don't know if this is the guy, or we had police officers obviously that would come in and also talk,
which
and
is
like
not
do the dare
appropriate.
thing. They would go off on these tangents. I can remember I think I was probably in 5th grade for this one cop that I remember, and I'm pretty sure he basically said, like, if you smoke, like, you kill a brain. Like, that was his thing. Like, if you smoke, you kill a brain cell. If you do that, it was very like, you do this, you get this. And like everything that you're telling me about the studies and how this is completely against.
Well, I mean, regardless of what we may say about brain growth, there's certainly no evidence that smoking pot kills brain cells. Like, that's just factually untrue.
Not according to my DARE officer. Yeah. Not according to my DARE officer.
Your DARE officer clearly had some good training. I feel like that was, I mean, and this was part of what killed the whole things like DARE, is because they spewed bullshit. And like people like, I mean, one of the reasons I ended up going into studying drugs is because I didn't believe anything I was being told. And they would give you these booklets and you'd start questioning them and be like, well, what do you mean? And no one would have an answer because there was no actual understanding. It was just scare tactics, which I think is a terrible approach to be going at it. But so no, cannabis, no, there's no evidence that, I mean, maybe at like ungodly levels that would never be humanly possible. Anything can kill a brain cell. I mean, you drink enough fucking water, you can die from water. So yes, at a certain level, I'm sure you could find a dose of THC that would kill brain cells. Nothing that would ever be consumed by a human would ever result in loss of brain cells. What you might see is like the way that neurons develop is they have all these branches like trees. What you could make the argument for is that perhaps the complexity of that branch structure might be reduced. That seems to be what we've seen from things like adolescent TBI, for example, or really profound levels of adolescent stress. You're not losing brain cells. They don't have as many arms to them, so they're not talking to as many other brain cells, which means that the way that the whole circuit nature of the brain interacts with each other may not function as optimally. That's really what you'd see. And that would account for like thinner parts of the brain, maybe, because there's not as much brain matter in there because there's not as many of these little arms. There's certainly no evidence of cell death. But even for the idea that you'd have like a thinner cortex or less brain matter is very controversial. And I none of the studies that have really found this have done it in a convincing manner, and it doesn't replicate, and it doesn't hold up to large-scale studies. So in the last 3 years, last 4 years, we've had 3 really big studies. One of them was in Colorado. And I like this study especially because the guy who ran the study initiated it by saying, look, the big problem is we have this potpourri of people who are documented as pot smokers that we study, but there's so much variance. So he said, fuck it, let's load the deck in our favor to find an effect. So he took people that smoked every single day and only used daily smokers. And he looked at their brain development and compared it to kids who weren't and wasn't able to find any differences in any brain structure. He then looked at the adults who'd been smoking and compared them to that. But he did a really careful job because he didn't just use cannabis. He made sure that both groups matched on every variable. So they consumed comparable levels of alcohol, smoked comparable levels of cigarettes. He even went as far to look at like interactions with the criminal justice system, personality variables. Like he was trying to account for all the things that could distinguish groups like this. And when you did that, he didn't see anything. And then 2 other big scale studies that were at least 1,000 people that they tracked were also not able to find any discernible effect on brain development from cannabis as a sole variable. If you isolate everything else and just look at cannabis. Now, that doesn't mean it won't fuck up someone's brain development because like I'm saying, I do believe it's clear there are vulnerable groups. Who those vulnerable groups are, we don't know yet. But as a kind of broad principle for the population, I don't think it's appropriate or accurate to say that smoking pot is going to mess up your brain development or kill brain cells because I don't think there's actually any evidence that supports that on a population level.
Is there, then I should ask Alex, as far as concussions and brain trauma go with adolescents, do you see something similar? Am I more at a risk as a teenager of either getting concussed, which we should probably define as we figured out that none of us know what a concussion actually is, but is it worse for me essentially if I get a concussion at 14 as opposed to 45?
So I guess the short answer, based on my research and reading the literature, is we don't quite know yet. And a big reason for this is actually due to a lack of representation over, the history of TBI research, with the exception of probably the last decade, where people have started focusing in on that age group. And it's really surprising, frankly, because they are one of the largest demographics that we see at least a concussion-like traumatic brain injury in. Adolescent age in particular, due to lots of things. When you're an adolescent and you kind of jump into those stages of life, you start exploring the world more. You actually start engaging in more risk-taking behavior. And the most common cause being sports-related injuries. This is a prime time where, kids are really starting to get to the point where they're in more contact sports and actually starting to hit each other, like football and soccer is a big one as well, with heading and other collision type injuries. But, today we're still kind of learning what are the, ultimate impacts of this. And no one's really done a controlled longitudinal study to look at, a population of kids, adolescent age, who are in this very vulnerable demographic, and follow them out until, through adulthood, and see there are definitely correlations, I think, between brain injuries and things like earlier onset of neurodegenerative disorders, things like dementias, Alzheimer's disease. There are correlations that have been made here. But whether or not sustaining, multiple concussions, a single concussion, let alone multiple concussions during that developmental period of adolescence, what that ultimately means, in terms of the chronic aspects of later life things. I think we're still trying to figure that out. And that's something our lab's really interested in and pushing towards, and trying to understand, how the brain repairs itself normally. If you're an adult and you have these established, brain networks and, the immune system has developed. In adolescence, it's not just, the brain that's developing, but your immune system is changing as well. And we know that to resolve an injury, we need the immune system to aid in the repair processes. So could it be as well that not only your brain is in a more potentially vulnerable state, but that your immune system during that period is not operating at its full capacity to really be efficient at repairing the way it should? So there's still a lot of questions for sure, but I think it's becoming more and more recognized that this is something that's very important that we need to know more about, as it is such a prevalent public health issue, worldwide, in terms of that demographic having these injuries. Oh yeah, sorry. So this is another one that one of these mysteries a little bit, in terms of this term concussion, and how we diagnose it and what does it really mean. So in general, people, consider you get hit in the head and you can or cannot lose consciousness, but you're disoriented and you could have some lingering symptoms like headaches, trouble concentrating, sensitivities to things like light and sound that persist for, a period of time. And we consider that they probably had a concussion. From the medical standpoint, as I was mentioning to you guys earlier, it's primarily diagnosed using this test of verbal and motor responses called the Glasgow Coma Scale. So they will, if you have an injury and you go in and you see the physician, and they'll run you through this battery of things like speaking responses of your eyes to, verbal commands or where to move, or visual cues. And they'll basically score you on your performance. And the different tasks all have different, 1 to 5, with 5 being the worst, 5 being the best or normal function, versus 1 being like no response at all. And this is what's really used. Today we are getting better with neuroimaging. If you can get them into an MRI, there are things like what we call diffuse white matter tract damage, which I won't go into all the details there, but this really gets to the core concept of what is a concussion, what does it look like, and what's actually happening inside your head. A concussion is classified as a form of mild traumatic brain injury. So what that means is there are plenty of mild traumatic brain injuries that occur that are never diagnosed as concussions, and these might even be the more silent issues that are not being recognized. When you have an impact for an MTB, mild TBI, or what we call an MTBI, you don't typically have this focal injury where your brain has damage in a very localized spot due to, let's say, the brain moving. You get hit in the side of the head here, and as your skull accelerates this way, the brain lags behind, and it can, in some more moderate cases, actually impact the side of the wall at a high enough velocity to cause focal damage. But you don't typically see that. What actually happens is you have the brain lagging behind as your head's accelerating this way. The brain is slower to accelerate, and it finally catches up in velocity as your skull's slowing down on the recoil, and it takes time for the brain to slow down as well. And the big issue is that different parts of your brain have different densities. So when they accelerate and decelerate, we think of the brain as the whole, maybe, moving like this, but there are small parts of the brain in different areas that some of them move faster than others. And this causes strain, stretching on those nerve cells that can cause breaks, interrupt communication. And this is what leads to what I was mentioning, the white matter tract damage. So we can see that using MRI-based imaging, looking at water diffusion essentially in the brain, and diagnose those things. But I think what really needs to be done is identifying, and this is the same thing with so many disorders, is finding an accurate biomarker, something that, let's say we could take a blood sample and there is something in the blood that relates to you had an MTBI or a concussion, and we just don't know what those are yet, or if there is something that we could do. But that would drastically help with the diagnosis side of things and classifying these injuries.
So how are helmets preventing one side, the brain actually from one part of your brain not moving as quickly
really
as the other part?
I think helmets are preventing you. Obviously, if you go head to head with a header in soccer without a helmet and you guys crack skulls, that's going to cause a little more of a severe, potentially the brain smacking the inside of the skull. The helmet's going to prevent that more damage to the skull, prevent things like that, but it's really just a game of inertia. It is the acceleration, the deceleration, and probably most importantly, rotation of your brain. So your brain sits in the skull in this insulated fluid sac, right? It kind of prevents it from doing these things. But when you have a substantial impact like that, even though you may not have a contusion or something on your head, the entire brain can be affected in that matter. Now, I don't personally think helmets are preventing mild
that kind of goes
TBIs.
back to goalkeepers a lot of times in soccer, they get hit in the head, so they start wearing headgear, and it's like, okay, well, with that information, pretty much useless, just like helmets in American football are useless based on that information. But it kind of, I've been on the other side for soccer, like how, they recently, and I know that I sent you that article, Alex, for kids under the age of 12, heading being banned in the sport, and I believe we're the only country, the only federation in the world that has come forward with something like that, where we're banning heading for kids. And I don't know about you, Will, Tyler, but heading was something that I always kind of avoided unless there was a goal scoring opportunity. I never wanted to head the ball. If the ball is coming, why would I want to put my head on a ball coming 50 yards out of the air and then head? It freaking hurts, man. I'd rather just have the ball come down and settle at my foot and then go from there, and that's kind of how we were trained by, Will's dad, who is our coach. Right. But, would you kind of agree with the idea, hey, let's reduce the amount of times kids are taking this contact? Or are we potentially setting them up The other, the side of the argument is, hey, if we don't teach them how to head properly early on, they're going to go into age 13 and they're just going to get messed up. They're going to be not keeping their neck, flex. They're not going to be hitting the ball through with the forehead where it's the thicker part of the skull, things like that. So I just kind of want to hear your commentary on that.
Yeah, I don't want to, I don't want to say this in a way that I'm saying like, you had the ball once or you had to do this a few times, you're just completely messed up. This is not the case, right? But, reducing the risk of acquiring these sorts of things is probably the main goal here. And a lot of it is stemmed from, a pathology that we still don't really understand completely, but the NFL, epidemic of what they call CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, where you're finding that these professional athletes, linemen, linebackers, who are every down getting hit at a high velocity, force for a decade straight. They got tens to hundreds of thousands of these, subconcussive types of microscopic injuries that seem to compound into chronic neurodegenerative diseases. So what the threshold is for that, like, I don't think there's a number, like once you've had your 9,999th, hit, don't have the next one because then you're screwed. I don't think it's as simple as that, but we do appreciate that there is a very strong correlation between repeated mild injuries like concussions and problems later on in life with brain health. There's obviously acute issues as well. As I mentioned, some of them, there's motor issues. Sometimes you lose some more motor coordination. You can, have issues with sleep. Sleep disturbances are a big thing as well with these types of injuries. Focus, all these things. And for the most part, I think it's fairly well accepted that most people will recover. You may have transient symptoms when you have an injury like this, but most people recover within a week. And I think this is what's driven kind of some of the concussion protocols saying, okay, sit out a week before you go back to play. But we're still learning what the ultimate long-term, effects of these things are. And without having properly, powered and controlled studies, particularly at the human level where you could, track a cohort of adolescents, who, are sustaining either in football and hockey, soccer, and follow them up and look for things like development of neurodegenerative diseases later in life. Obviously, there's a lot of factors in there still. You have, a whole lifespan period of other events that can contribute, but it'll start to help us understand the true consequences of sustaining these injuries during the adolescent state. And as Matt pointed out, I think, one thing I'm interested in as well, and we've chatted a little bit, is what is the impact of cannabis on the injured developing brain? Is it possible that that is one of those states where cannabis could have a detrimental effect? Where particularly we're looking at inflammation, brain inflammation, how the immune cells, repair some of these damaged things. And there's pretty decent evidence, I think, that at least CBD has some anti-inflammatory capacity to it. So it is known to regulate immune cells as well. So what is the impact, one, on the neurons that are injured in those states, but also the mechanisms that the body uses to bring things back to.
So Alex, I'm curious, because one of the things I would say with TBI, at least, that gives you a little bit better of a control is that actually is something you can do in an animal model properly. I mean, the cannabis thing's a little more complicated, but because it's actually interesting that this is, two conversations at once happening in this area, because this is exactly the conversation that happened in the Canadian government about legalization, because the argument was made, well, we don't know if it's going to damage a teenage brain, but it could. And the public health community's response was, but the same is true for hockey. It's Canada, so it's hockey. It's the sport we use. But the argument was, we know kids play hockey. We know they sustain head injuries from playing hockey, and we understand that comes with a risk, but we don't ban it. We don't prevent it from happening. We try and recognize that regardless of prohibition, people are still going to do something. And so therefore we need to understand it better to figure out how to regulate it. And I mean, it's interesting because I feel like this is one of, the lifespan study you're talking about would be the thing you'd need, and it's not going to happen. It just will never happen because you're never going to get a human researcher who has the money to track a cohort of humans for like 70 years. They would die themselves. So it would never happen. And so you almost need animal studies in there to figure that out. But the other thing I think that's important here, since we're talking about adolescence a lot, is like it was only 2 decades ago when we actually as a community even began to recognize that the adolescent brain was different. Like, this is why I'd say there's such a lack of a knowledge base here. I mean, there were studies that came out at NIH, like the stuff that Jay Geed and BJ Casey were doing at the end of the 90s, that were the first time they started neuroimaging teenagers and realizing that, for one, it wasn't just this linear growth pattern, that adolescence is this weird period where the brain actually overdevelops. And it creates this very large roadmap that it then lets experience refine to determine how you're going to become an adult brain. So we have this period where we make too many synapses. There's like more neural connections than normal during adolescence. And then based on the experiences we have, the brain figures out what connections it needs and what it doesn't. And then it just cleans the rest of them out so that you actually get this refined brain into adulthood. And that's why, as we've learned this in the last 15, 20 years, there has become such an emphasis on understanding the adolescent brain, because now we realize that shit that happens during adolescence, basically, the example I always use to kids when I ever try and talk to them about drug stuff is I say, think of it this way. When you're in adolescence, it's like wet cement. You put your hands in, whatever your handprints do, it's fixed. You can do that on a hardened cement. It doesn't do shit. That's like the adult brain. But the adolescent brain, because of this plasticity it has, you can get indelible permanent signatures built in there from shit that happens to you. And so, again, going back even to the cannabis thing, but same with TBIs, I think that the argument has always been on the side of risk. And so it's like, well, we should reduce the risks of things that can do that, even if we're not certain they will. And that's why, like you're saying, Will, like the DARE messaging, that was the approach they used to take, was just scare the shit out of kids and then they won't do stuff, which clearly did not work. And in fact, I find the most ironic thing is DARE. The only studies that have been done actually show that it increased drug use in kids, not reduced. Because
I guarantee you, there's so many kids in my class probably like, fuck this.
Well, no, actually what it did to a lot of kids is a lot of kids had been so sheltered, they didn't even know these drugs existed, and then cops came in and introduced them to them. And then you couple that with the rebellion of teenagers, and they're like, fuck this, I'm going to do this now that I've learned about it. So they actually found that those were hugely ineffective approaches. Like, no abstinence approach is going to work for a teen. It doesn't work for sex. It doesn't work for drugs. It doesn't work for sports. You can't tell them not to do stuff. So you have to try and understand what the best way of talking to them are. So, I mean, like, what we've done in Canada is we have what we call the low-risk cannabis use guidelines, which have been modified for teenagers. The very first one is, if you want no risk, don't use cannabis, period. That's obviously the gold standard of reducing risk, is you remove everything. But, if kids don't have sex or, use drugs or play sports, that's like, as much as we hate to deny this is at a societal level, that is the adolescent experience. So if you take that away, it's going to have a huge impact on what teenagers are. Mm-hmm. So it's trying to figure out a way to actually tell them. So what we say is, if you can, vape plant matter instead of smoking. Not talking about the pen stuff, because there's concerns there, obviously, as we've talked about. But like, if you vape plant matter, it doesn't have combustion. So the damage you do to your lungs is less than what you'd have from smoking. We also say, there's a myth about holding it in longer will get you higher. That's not true. You're just going to do more damage to your lungs. Don't do that. If you're going to get high, don't. No, it doesn't.
Sorry.
You're
going to movie once again.
Yeah.
Movies, I never smoked, but like, that's it. Like, that's the thing. You take that and then you just hold it in. The longer you hold it in, the more manly you are, and the higher.
As a feat of masculinity, I'm not going to speak in there, but from a perspective of actually getting high, it doesn't seem to do much. Most of the THC immediately rushes out of the whatever's in your lung into the blood. So it doesn't really do anything. But again, it's like, so they've taken what we call a harm reduction approach, which is, let's just be honest with the kids and say, if you're going to use it, we're not going to say, we're going to encourage you not to, but we recognize that you're going to. And if you're going to, at least engage in these harm reduction strategies. And they've got a similar thing, I think, like you were saying, Brandon, about the not letting heading. I think it's the similar approach.
Yeah.
Like this is kind of the public health approach that they've tried is, well, if we can reduce engagement in certain things, so and so. And that's why, like, even for us, like in Alberta, where Alex and I live, cannabis is legal at 18. Like,
Yeah.
so, I mean, like, you've made the decision that at 18, and this is where a big argument came in because everyone's like, well, it shouldn't be legal to 25 because the brain develops then. And I was arguing with government officials and people in the news saying, do you have any idea how confusing this is to tell a kid you can drink at 18, you can vote at 18, and you can go to war at 18, but you can't smoke pot? And especially in the context of alcohol, how fucked up is that? Because we know, we have done a lot of research. We understand what alcohol does to the developing brain far more than we understand other things. And yet we're giving an implicit suggestion that at 18 it's okay to drink. That means it's safe, but cannabis isn't. And so the government ultimately agreed with our perspective that you had to harmonize it. You cannot create a discrepancy between alcohol and cannabis. If you've made the choice to legalize them, they have to be treated the same. If anything, alcohol should be worse, but you certainly can't demonize cannabis on top of it.
That was going to be my question. There is one that is worse, though, correct? Or is there just one that's worse because of the way we can treat it, or the way that we are interacting with it?
I would say across the board, alcohol is worse than cannabis. Depending on how you look at every metric, you can make the argument. You can overdose acutely and die from consuming too much alcohol. You cannot do that from cannabis. Chronic alcoholism is related to a huge host of health conditions, cirrhosis of the liver, immune issues, neurological issues that all are very clearly related to alcohol consumption. You don't see those come up with cannabis the same way. The toll on society from aggression, violence, and drunk driving accidents that happen from people intoxicated on alcohol is cannabis pales in comparison to anything like that. And then when you factor in the rate of dependency that people develop, it's somewhere around 22% of people that will drink that will transition into a state of dependency with alcohol. Cannabis is about 9%. So even the rates that you see of people that shift from recreational use to dependency or problematic use or addiction, however you want to define it, is less. So no matter how you break it down, you can even die from withdrawal of alcohol. Like if you're a massive alcoholic, you cannot just stop cold turkey. You will literally have seizures and die. And this has been well documented. It's why it has to be a weaning process. It has to be often medically supervised if you're a super alcoholic, because of the fact that it is the toll it takes on the body is so profound and the rebound effects of withdrawal. You don't see any of that with cannabis. You see a withdrawal syndrome, but you certainly can't die from it. So alcohol, in many ways, I would say it's unarguable that it's less damaging than cannabis. I don't see how anyone could make that position. My perspective is the only reason alcohol is legal is because they tried making it illegal in the States, and that was the birth of all organized crime. Like that era of prohibition built Al Capone and all organized crime because they could not quench the demand for alcohol. It's too much of a regular component that people have used. And cannabis doesn't have that history, so it didn't have the same thing. It was easier to shut cannabis down than it was alcohol because it wasn't as widely used. But I'm like, there's this bizarre misconception that legality dictates safety, and that is 100% not true.
Totally.
Can I jump back a little bit to we got kind of going down the route of adolescence and kind of focusing there a little bit. But one thing I think as well, and Matt will agree with me, that's been underrepresented is understanding the differences in sex and biological sex. How do males and females have different responses to these things? And I can speak to the TBI side of things, but I'm not as familiar with the cannabis research. Matt, do you have any insights? Like, does cannabis affect?
Yeah, I would say almost certainly. It is one of the drugs that definitely has a bigger sex difference. The first thing I always say to people is look over the age of 25 and tell me what the sex of the person who smokes pot on a daily basis is. It is like very rarely a woman. It is almost always a man. There is, and women report far more adverse events to using cannabis than men do in the sense of like feeling uncomfortable, panicky, anxiety. It may actually be a sensitivity issue. It does appear that women have more receptors for THC than men do. So it may just be that men have a wider window of cannabis being positive and not negative, and women that may transition quicker. And so, especially with more potent products that are on the market, that shift from like a good dose to a too much might be much narrower in a woman than a man. But that being said, some of the stuff like my friend Ziva Cooper's done at UCLA, like she's been studying this in women. Women do also find cannabis more rewarding sometimes. And she has this thing they call telescoping, where from first use to dependence, women will actually be more likely to go down that path with cannabis. So there's probably some social issues as well, women, about women who use drugs and don't. There's a lot of cultural and social issues that are going to influence who uses drugs and who it's considered acceptable and who it's not. And obviously, because then you get into the 20s and 30s, and women who, if they're pregnant, they're obviously not going to, the majority of them will not be using drugs because they don't want to expose the fetus to anything. Yeah. So there's a lot of factors that will dictate the sex difference that exists in cannabis use. But when you look at the adolescent stuff, it's not really been, the animal stuff would suggest that it's different, that it's not that one's worse than the other. If you go really high dosing with THC, you see some effects. They just don't appear to be the same in males and females. Like, males may have more cognitive effects, females may have more emotional effects. That's some of the suggestions they've had. But
I think it's just an important thing to keep in mind, when we're talking about all these things and the data behind it and supporting it. And obviously, within the past decade, I think more attention has been focused on these things, but largely the data that, is out there has all been from male cohorts, and we're making these broad generalizations about the human population as a whole, while only considering, the impact on the male brain. And maybe it's been, more than a decade since this is really kind of coming and recognized, but I think it's important to note that side of, the data and the statistics and the things that are out there are largely biased to the male population. And it makes sense in some instances if you have an issue or something like that, a pressing issue where really it's only males that are either like embarking down that path or, but in the TBI side of things, like, the highest rates of concussions in females or in sports is in female soccer players, it appears. Based on, the data that I've seen, the highest rates of at least adolescent, teenage concussive injuries occur in female soccer players.
From my experience being in college and stuff, like women were always having more issues with concussions than the male teams. And I don't know if it seemed like a lot of it had to do with falling and hitting their head on the ground more so than the ball coming out of the air or anything like that. So neck strength or core strength, I'm not just trying to say they're weak.
Yeah, there's a few things. There's a few things to note. It appears that women often present with more pronounced deficits, neurological kind of effects of having these injuries, but women are also more likely to go to the doctor and actually go report versus, the macho man saying, "I'm all right, coach, give me a minute and put me back in." So there is some skewing in the reporting there, but it is apparent and that the male and the female brain are very different, obviously, and they respond differently to these things. So I think, our research moving forward, I know Matt does a lot in his lab. We focus all of our studies right now on, we do everything in both males and females, just because
especially our adolescent cannabis exposure stuff. We're looking at that closely for males and females.
Yeah, no, I got a concussion in college. But someone was clearing the ball out, hit me straight in the side of the head, knocked me clean out. I came out for 2 minutes maybe, and the coach was like, "How you doing? You doing all right?" I was like, "Yeah, it's overtime. I got to get back in there." Hop back out on the field. I swear to God, someone passed me the ball. I settled it. I looked up, and everything was just blur, just absolutely nothing. I remember just kicking the ball forward and then walking off the field, and I don't remember anything else from the night. But yeah.
And then this first, there's actually the big issue with this, and I think which is behind, the very strict concussion protocols now, is this phenomenon called second impact syndrome or second hit syndrome, where There have been numerous documented cases where someone had a concussion, went back out, however they had it, received a second hit within, a pretty quick time frame and died from it because you lose what appears to happen, along with the neurological effects of a concussion is the blood flow to your brain becomes dysregulated. So normally you need to keep the blood flow to your brain pretty tightly controlled because, if you fluctuate nutrients and oxygen even slightly, you can have dramatic effects on brain tissue. And what happens in general, while it's, not super clear because the studies have not been completely controlled, it appears that after you have a concussion, you have some sustained period of what we call hypoperfusion. So you have less blood going to the brain. So if you receive that second injury, it could lead to things like just complete collapse of blood flow to the brain where you stroke out. That's probably the most common reason why people who have, 2 concussions, just boom, boom, have these dramatic effects. But I think it's really been the driving force behind solidifying these important concussion protocols, making sure that people don't return.
They had me didn't let me go back after that if they diagnosed it, but hey, I was taking my managerial accounting test the next day, so that went very well. I can imagine.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Never been so confused in my life.
All my concussions, well, all the ones they told me. I honestly, because obviously I've been playing sports my entire life. And just to your point, B, you did ask us how we dealt with heading as kids. And, I know Tyler has coached a whole lot of camps as well. And I don't know if he'll agree with this, but many of the kids that take shots to the head that I'm really concerned about are the ones that, A, they don't know how to head properly. Yeah. They're already afraid of it. And they, for some reason, after not understanding how to do it and already being scared, they're the ones that either the ball has a magnet to them. I'm not sure how it is, but the largest punts out from the field are always going right at them. And the kids that know how to head, they know that you don't take a ball head on. I don't know if this is just something you never do that ever. Even I understand they always deflect it, right? They know to deflect the header or to charge it and to put some sort of force back on it. But those kids that just don't know it, those are the ones that I'm so scared of because they'll put their head and then the ball it's just this 70-mile-an-hour ball. Just smashing them in the head, and it happens 3 or 4 times a game. And they, so I mean, I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. It's never going to happen over here in Europe, where really they're going to say, or it's never going to happen in Brazil. It's not going to happen in Africa. They're not going to change the game. Soccer is just they can't do that. And Brazil would be worried about producing the next Pele, who doesn't know how to head the ball by the time he's 15. It's just not. This is a national treasure type thing. So I don't know. I mean, I've definitely been rocked by some shots and and hitting my head up against the board in indoor games and stuff like that. So who knows,
On the topic of dispelling myths to some extent, I'm curious in your guys' experience when you were diagnosed with a concussion, were you told not to go to sleep?
No.
This is one of the biggest myths in concussion. The whole field is, everyone for decades upon decades were saying, don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep. This is very bad. But we know very well now that sleep is one of the best things to repair your brain. It's the point where you clear toxins. And it's actually, I was curious because I've heard 50-50 on the physician sides right now on whether they suggest going to sleep or not, and I think that it's become clear that was true, a major myth associated with.
No, that's what I was told. Yeah, that's what I was told.
But you might do your due diligence and fact check me before you post this, but I am 95% confident that.
No, it seemed very counterproductive when I'm laying in my bed after being smashed in the head by a soccer ball that I can't go to sleep and I'm having to sit there just trying to stay awake, because that was literally what I was told to do. And outside of that, it was they told me to stay in dark rooms, and then I would come back in for tests and they would have a computer screen So we'd come in preseason, we'd have like a pre-screening of like remembering different shapes and drawings and words and things like that. And I'm terrible with that stuff, even when I'm not concussed. So, you know, that was really the gauge, and it wasn't really a good representation of if I'm getting better or not, concussion wise. But yeah, it was.
I mean, when you have an injury, you need rest to repair, correct? Right. So it is counterproductive to stress your brain even more. Obviously, they have you be in a dark room, quiet, so you don't have all this sensory information coming in that's exciting your brain along those lines. But sleep is really, again, we're still learning. I'm with Matt. Like, I find the sleep field fascinating, and why more people don't study things like cannabis and sleep and anything in sleep. But what we do, you know, really appreciate now is that is the period where you have the most, you know, clearance of toxins, byproducts. You know, I mean, as you're, you know, doing your daily things, you're producing byproducts that are basically filling up your brain that need to be removed, because if they linger too long, they can have, you know, dramatic effects on your brain. That's why, like, you can also die from not sleeping, right? I mean, there comes a point where you're not clearing some of these more toxic byproducts.
I mean, sleep is very hard to study, but I feel like that's what you guys should do. Like, what the fuck is sleep? Like, what's a dream? Like, shit like no one knows. And I feel like it's just amazing that it kind of sits there still. And I think it's just, sleep is very hard to study, but it's a shame because it's clearly at the root of a whole bunch of stuff.
Well, I don't know if you guys have seen a really great film. It's called Inception. I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of sleep and study.
I think that might be some of the issues.
Those are fun.
Yeah.
Right.
I've had an Inception dream before where, like, I thought I was awake and it turns out I was still in a dream. And getting on the point of, we were talking about, you know, withdrawal and nightmares and stuff like that. It was induced by leaving a nicotine patch on when I went to bed, where my body normally didn't have nicotine in the system, you know, when I'm sleeping, because no one's sitting there smoking while they're asleep. And then, you know, when I was quitting, there were a couple nights where I had forgotten to take the patch off, which is giving you a pretty steady state, you know, dose of nicotine in the system. And I've never had more vivid nightmares. And in that case, I had like a nightmare that it was like 3 layers deep, where I was getting strangled by like the sheet in the bed, and I woke up, but it turns out I wasn't awake.
Are you sure with a nicotine patch?
Anyway,
Need some studies. Well, I think we're close to on our time in general. So, I mean, we obviously appreciate you guys coming in. This is obviously eye-opening, as we've busted enough myths here today, quite a few, you know, which is going to help our fan base. And since the giant majority of our fan base is in this age range, that, you know, we've been talking about, they're definitely guys from 18, 25. Definitely, that's like our big core group who I think are going to take a whole lot out of this. So definitely appreciate you guys coming on. Is there anything else you guys wanted to shout out? Is there anything going on? Like, do we get you some grant money? Do we need to like call FIFA up, or like?
Yeah. What can we get done for you guys? Yeah. What can we get done?
Alex, get some concussion money from soccer leagues. There you go.
Everyone
had been hitting the NFL. Go to soccer leagues. It makes.
Our rodent model that we use in the lab was developed during the CTE pandemic to model NFL injuries. So it was developed by a group in Chicago after the NFL put out a competition, $1 million prize, to develop a TBI rodent, an animal model that actually mimics the types of injuries that these football players have. So that is our primary model in the lab right now for studying these things. So maybe there's opportunities.
I really want to get some adolescent rats, get them super high repeatedly, like make them wake and bakers for a few weeks, and then give them an injury. I want to see what happens with TBI. Like, not in like, oh, I'm going to medicate myself and smoke a joint before I get a head hit, but just in like chronic users, does it shift the baseline to change the magnitude or extent of a mild TBI damage? And then also, like, if you have clear behavior neuropathological endpoints, it'd be interesting after the TBI to then get them high to see how it affects recovery separately. Yeah, those would be interesting. We merge the conversation.
Yep, I think that would be a good hotspot for bringing in some research money for sure. That's combining two very, very frontline fields right now that they're.
That's perfect. We can call it the Biscuits and Tea Research, or I don't know how you guys name your papers and whatever, but we can if we can name it after us. You guys discover something revolutionary. We'd like just we don't need any money or anything like that. We just like to be included.
Yeah, that's it.
We just like to be. We want to do our part. So we'll let you guys study it, but we'll take some credit now. All right. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, guys.
I guess that's it. B team, we're out.